Calling for more protests against President Nicolas Maduro, in Venezuela, Juan Guaido continues his bid to push Maduro from power. After declaring himself interim president, Guaido and his supporters have been handing out leaflets offering amnesty to soldiers notably, hoping that the military, which has been loyal to Maduro, will join the call for change.
They've come to an army headquarters in Caracas to persuade soldiers to reject President Nicolas Maduro and join the opposition cause. On offer, an amnesty if the soldiers help return Venezuela to democracy. In response, soldiers burnt the amnesty document. Over at Navy headquarters, opposition MP Ismael Leon had a go, trying to convince troops.
Understanding this document will allow Venezuelans to continue living in a democracy. The country's democracy is in your hands.
The scene was repeated at various locations. The battle is on for the military's backing on both sides of Venezuela's political divide. The country's self-proclaimed acting interim president, opposition leader Juan Guaido, called for army backing after a mass in honor of protesters killed in a government crackdown.
Venezuelan soldiers, I'm speaking to you. Now is the time to get on the side of the Constitution. Now is not the time to be afraid.
So far, the army has stood by Nicolas Maduro, who appeared on television with troops.
They want Venezuela's armed forces to become putschists. Are you putschists? Or are you constitutionalists? Traitors? Never. Loyal? Always.
U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton has weighed in, warning the Venezuelan army and authorities of a significant response for anyone using any violence or intimidation against the opposition or, quote, Venezuela's democratic leader Juan Guaido.
Venezuela then clearly in the midst of social, economic and political chaos. To give us his perspective, we're joined on set by Venezuelan author Vincente Ulive. Thanks so much for coming in and giving us your time. Let me start perhaps by asking you, Mr. Ulive, this man, Guaido, is he the man to lead? I mean, he's declared himself interim president, but Maduro doesn't look to be going anywhere.
Yes, he does seem to be. It's the first time that the opposition has been able to coalesce around a figure. So that's the difference between 2014 and 2017 when we already had these protests. He seems to be a very charismatic person. So the thing is that things are evolving so fast that maybe a month and a half ago I would have had a different answer. But now it does seem clear that he is the man to coalesce the opposition around and maybe call for elections, which is what he seems to be doing.
You do think he has legitimacy?
He does have legitimacy from the point of view that the last open and free elections, which were in 2015, he was a part of them and he's the member of the parliament. So he has more legitimacy than Nicolas Maduro would have with his election last year.
Now, we have seen Nicolas Maduro say that Guaido's move is part of a US-sponsored coup, and we have seen, US interference in the past. And indeed, Washington was one of the first to get behind Guaido.
Absolutely, yes. But there's also very different factions at play here. I mean, we have Russian interference, we have Chinese interference, we have Cuban interference. So there's many different factions that are playing for power in Venezuela. Obviously, the United States do have vested interests in what happens in the region. Up to what point they're behind Guaido is just a preposterous kind of claim to make. But of course, if you have a government in Latin America, you have to have ties to the United States. You have to have some sort of communication. That seems to be what he has had up till now.
Indeed, you mentioned there the international reactions, and we saw the US and Brazil very quickly coming in to back Guaido. We had Russia and China, and indeed, I believe China, the debt with Venezuela is $65 billion worth. Where do you think that all might play out? And, do you think already they're having an influence on developments there?
Absolutely. I mean, the most disturbing thing here is that there's different perspectives that can arise. It can go from Nicolas Maduro staying in power. That's a possibility. It can go from splinter sections inside of the military just dividing up and shooting it out amongst themselves, or anywhere in between. At this point, it is very difficult, almost impossible to predict. We have had these uprisings in the past, and they've led nowhere. They've just petered out over the time. So that's also a possibility. That seems to be Maduro's play, is to just let it go and peter out.
But one thing that does look to be different is the population that seems to be coming out onto the streets. We're seeing more and more people. Is this, from what we're seeing abroad, you can tell us how valid that perception is, that there's more people from poorer neighbours coming out, people who up to now would have been very strong Chavist supporters.
Absolutely. I mean, the latest polls show that 4 out of 5 Venezuelans reject Nicolas Maduro's government, so that's a vast majority of people. And ever since 2007, approximately, the opposition started making inroads into popular neighborhoods. So now the hardcore liners that are behind the government must be around 20 or 30%, but the vast majority is looking at least for something else.
Due, I imagine, to the dire economic situation. But
yes.
The 20% that do support, they seem to be, in a large way, the people with the power, notably the army. They're all loyal to Maduro. That's unlikely to change.
Yes, I guess that's the thing that is at play here, because he has the military, but he doesn't have the rank and file soldiers. I mean, we're talking about the generals that have access to petrol and that have been given these positions by Maduro to keep them in power. So the generals, yes, they are with Maduro, but the rank and file soldiers, the defections are up. They're actually thrown in jail. So it's a very tense situation right now inside of the military in Venezuela.
And when you look at going forward, if things go forward to fresh elections, because even a number of European countries have called on Maduro to make that the way forward, to call for new elections and see what happens, the opposition up to now has been very divided. Isn't that not just what we'll see repeating itself again?
We'll see. We'll have to see. But in any case, it's a better case scenario than what we have now. But the problem is that you can't just call for elections within a week or within 3 weeks, because the whole system has been rotting for ages. So you have the Electoral Committee is controlled by Maduro, so you'd have to take control of that. The Supreme Tribunal was packed by judges by Chavez, so there are not impartial figures to have an election. You would have to have international observers, and you'd have to have different practices, because in all the elections up till now, Maduro and Chavez, what they did is that they would threaten state workers, they would plaster their faces all over ministries and things that are illegal even by the Venezuelan Constitution. So you need a free, fair, and open election, not just a sham election like we had last year.
And I've heard you in interviews in the past say that you're against any form of negotiation. So what you want to see is these elections, I guess the road to the election at least being set forward. But, do you not think there's any openness for dialogue in Venezuela between the two currently opposing sides?
Well, in order to have dialogue, you have to have good faith on the part of both sides. What's happened in the past, we've had numerous dialogues in the past, and what happens is always the government uses it as a stall tactic and never commits to what they do. In 2014, we had the church mediating a dialogue with the opposition, and they agreed on a certain number of things, and the government never came through. So this is just a tactic that is used to let the opposition peter out while people are still in jail, and we have a humanitarian crisis, and we can't let the food and medicines come in. So I don't see the need of a dialogue.
And give us a better idea of this crisis situation in Venezuela, because as I was saying again, there was very strong support for Hugo Chavez, and that does seem to have changed. What has changed so dramatically when it comes to the situation for Venezuelans?
Well, the economic situation is, it couldn't be worse. I mean, this was done through a series of corruption scandals that it would be difficult to get into, but the country has no more money left, basically, to put it in.
But it is oil rich. It's just that
it is oil rich, but the oil is in the ground. I mean, when Chavez came to power, we had 3.5 million barrels a day that were being produced. It was projected to go to 5. Right now we have 1.7 million. So production has gone down due to mismanagement and dwindling oil revenues. So all that has played a part. I mean, Venezuela is a country like almost all countries in the world. If the economy goes well, the people like the government. When the economy goes bad, the people don't like the government. And right now it's the worst economic situation in the history of Venezuela.
And how do you react to all this international reaction? The fact that some are openly backing Guaido, some are staying with Maduro. What do you think the international community should do?
Well, I think the international community is showing the militaries that if they back Guaido, then it will be all right, which is part of Guaido's plan. He's already talked about amnesty for militaries that would back a democratic transition. Guaido's not the president. He wants to be the president of a transition that would lead to a democracy or to an election, which seems to be the most democratic route we have right now, even though there are legal problems in between.
And when you hear the United States saying all options are on the table, more or less evoking a possible military intervention?
Oh, it's terrifying. It's completely terrifying. I mean, there are two scenarios here that are terrible. One is the military of Venezuela taking over and having like an old school Brazilian or Chilean dictatorship. The other one is the United States invading with boots on the ground unilaterally and removing also Maduro, which would lead to just a lot of bloodshed and a lot of strife and would not ultimately solve the problem.
And your current gut feeling is that we'll go down the road of elections, or it's impossible to tell?
It's my hope, my biggest hope is that we can do that, but as I've just said, it's very difficult to hold elections under these circumstances. A lot of things would have to change, so it's what I'm crossing my fingers for, but I do not see how we can take off the table any of the other options, unfortunately, at this moment.
Yeah, it might all be a bit too quick. Well, Vincente Ulive, Venezuelan author, thanks so much for coming in and giving us your time and insight.